This is part 2 of the presentation on the U.S. debt crisis. My name is Pat Obi, Professor of Finance at Purdue University, Calumet. Here's the big question. Is our national debt out of control? That's the question everybody is asking and dealing with. One way to evaluate this question is to compare the size of our debt to the size of the economy, measured by the gross domestic product. As you can see, if the size of your debt exceeds how much money you're pulling in, you do get a problem. So first, let's look at the performance of our economy since the market crash of 1929. Generally, it's been growing steadily, and then it really took off in the late 70s, early 80s, and never looked back, except for the little hiccup that you see up here. That's the global financial crisis and the collapse of the U.S. housing market. Now though, let's look at the GDP contributions by each of the recent presidents. You can see that President Carter, in his time in office, grew the economy by about $760 billion, or 27%. Reagan, about $2 trillion. All right, he raised it by 39% from start to finish. Bush Sr. by about $860 billion, 14%. Clinton, in his 8 years in office, kicked it up by 33%. That came up to $3.3 trillion. Now, though, George Bush Jr., in spite of the 9/11 era recession there and the collapse of the housing market that took place at the time he was about to leave office, managed to kick up the economy by $4 trillion, or 28%. Now, though, Obama, who inherited this hiccup right here, the collapse of the housing market and the global financial crisis, managed to inch it up by $590 billion within a year in office. That's 4% of our GDP. But this is not really the issue. The issue is how much debt did we incur during each of these presidential terms as a percent of the size of our economy. So that's what you're looking up here. And you can see here that from Reagan to Obama, the debt to GDP ratio has risen steadily, quite steadily, all right, getting worse and worse over the years. And then really all hell broke loose right down over here. And of course, the collapse of the housing market and the financial crisis aggravated the situation. However, the situation really started getting worse, from the early 2000s, as you can see here. Now, though, what I've done here is to show how much money we owe as a percent of GDP, specifically within each presidential term from right after the end of the Second World War. Well, actually, we had Truman before we had Eisenhower. So here's what I've done. Right, the placement of these bars for each of the presidents shows the relative contribution to our national debt. So, for example, you can see that Kennedy and Johnson, they kind of helped to draw down our debt to GDP ratio compared to the situation under Eisenhower. Of course, you remember, right about this time we were dealing with the Marshall Plan, the GI Bill. All of those cost a lot of money to the U.S. So, but now things came down quite nicely during Nixon. And Ford kind of inched up a little bit, so his bar is a little higher than that of Nixon. Carter lower than that of Ford because it went down some. And then look over here. Things kind of got really bad under Reagan and Bush Sr. All right, so the debt to GDP ratio kind of escalated. Inched up in the early years of Clinton, but then dropped down real nicely. And of course, you remember the high-tech boom and the resulting budget surplus we enjoyed. And then it went real bad under Bush and Obama, and that kind of put us into this big hole that we currently find ourselves in. And if you're interested, what I've done here is to color code the presidential terms. The reds are the Republican presidents and the blues are the Democratic presidents. And you can see here that between 1953 and 2008, which is when this is measured, that actually Republican administrations added 30 percentage points to the national debt to GDP ratio. Now, on the contrary, actually, the Dems subtracted 28 percentage points from that ratio. So that could be a talking point for some. Nevertheless, That's the hole we currently find ourselves in right now. So how big is this hole that we dug ourselves into? Well, as you know, you create debt because you spend more than you bring in. Under Carter, we spent more than we brought in to the tune of $253 billion. It kind of went wild. Under Reagan, $1.4 trillion in deficits. So all of these deficits add into go into the national debt. Bush Sr., a little over $1 trillion. Clinton kind of kept the situation under control quite a bit. All right, so he created a surplus of $63 billion from start to finish. And you can see the surplus right here because the red refers to spending, the green refers to revenues. Now though, here's where all hell broke loose under Bush and Obama. Under Bush, in his 8 years in office, he created well over $3.5 trillion in deficits. So that caused our national debt to escalate. And within 2 years in office, it's about $1.3 trillion in deficits under Obama. So this is the reason why we have this gaping hole here that looks like the widening jaw of a devouring crocodile. So here's what I've done to look at how much we spent and how much we brought in as a percent of the GDP. For example, under spending, you can see that spending as a percent of the GDP has hovered around 19-20%, and then boom, right down here, it overshot. All right, so we kind of overshot that error. You can see here it went up to 24-25%. So if anybody were to say that our debt crisis is the result of too much spending, that person is very, very correct. Now though, come right back here under revenues. You can see that revenues have hovered between 18 and 20% generally. But you can see here that from the early 2000s, it's generally declined as a percent of the GDP. And right now, it's under 15%. So you can see that how much money we're bringing into the government's coffers as a percent of the GDP has declined significantly over the years to levels that we've never seen in recent history. And so if anyone were to also say that our debt crisis is the result of bringing in too little tax revenues into the government's coffers, that person too is correct. Well, the complete moral of the story is that our debt crisis is the result of too much spending and too little revenues. All right, the data show the evidence here. So that revenue and debt is a percent of the GDP. Under each of these recent presidents, you can see how the hole gets big. Under Reagan, is big under Bush, kind of shrunk up and created deficits, surplus right here. And then look at that widening jaw again. So revenues and spending as a percent of the GDP is really a mirror image of what you saw earlier, which is simply revenues and spending in dollars under each of the presidents. So this picture you see here is the mirror image of this picture you see here. That's the telltale. Truly, our debt situation, debt problem, is the result of too much spending and too little revenues.